Pursued. Part 4. 5 tons of stone fell from a height of 12 feet. Jim had let out a savage yell and thrust his weight against the boulder. It landed right on top of the robot beneath him. Jim scrambled down to the scene. He stood there staring at the huge lump and shaking his head. He gave the boulder a kick. Ha! Walter and I might clear a buck or two yet from your little meat market. Maybe this expedition won't be a total loss. Enjoy yourself in hell, where you came from, he shouted at the bashed robot. Then he leaped back, his eyes wild. The giant rock was shifting. Slowly, its 5-ton bulk was sliding off the trail, raising a ridge of soil as it grated along. Even as he stared, the boulder tilted, and a grey protuberance appeared under the nearest edge. With a choked cry, Jim broke into a lurching run. He ran a full mile down the trail. Then finally he stopped and looked back. He could just make out a dark dot moving away from the fallen rock in the distance. It progressed as slowly and as regularly and as persistently and as relentless as before, and in his direction. Jim sat down heavily, putting his head in his scratched, grimy hands. But that despairing mood did not last. After all, he had gained a 20-minute respite. Lying down, trying to relax as much as possible, he took the flat packet of emergency rations from his jacket and, eating quickly but without bolting, disposed of some biscuit and chocolate. Then he had a few sips of icy water from a stream, and he was ready to continue his fantastic struggle. But first he swallowed one of the 3 Benzedrine pills he carried for physical crises. When the robot was still an estimated 10 minutes away, Jim trotted off, much of his wiry strength coming back with fresh courage to counter his bone-deep weariness. After running for 15 minutes, he came to a sheer face of rock about 30 feet high. A sheer face going up the way. The terrain on either side was barely passable, consisting of choked gullies, spiky brush and knife-edged rocks. If Jim could make it to the top of this little cliff, the robot for sure would have to detour, a circumstance that might put it many minutes behind him. He looked up at the sun, huge and crimson it was, almost touching the horizon. He would have to move fast. Jim was no rock climber, but he did know the fundamentals. Using every crevice, roughness and minute ledge, he fought his way up the cliff. Somehow, unconsciously, he used that flowing climb of a natural mountaineer, which takes each foothold very briefly as an unstressed pivot point in a series of rhythmic advances. He had just reached the top when the robot rolled up to the base of the cliff. Jim knew very well that he ought to just leave at once, taking advantage of the few precious remaining moments of daylight. Every second gained was of tremendous value, but curiosity and hope made him wait. He told himself that the instant his pursuer detoured, he would get out of there all the faster. Besides, the thing might even give up and he could sleep right here. Sleep. His body lusted for it. But the robot would not detour. It hesitated only a few seconds at the foot of the barrier. Then a number of knobs opened to extrude metallic wands. One of these, topped with lenses, waved in the air. Jim drew back too late. Their uncanny gaze had found him as he lay atop the cliff, peering down. He cursed his idiocy. Immediately, all the wands retracted, and from a different knob, a slender rod, blood red in the setting sun, began to shoot straight up to the man coming towards him. As he watched, frozen in place, its barbed tip gripped the cliff's edges, almost under his nose. Jim leaped to his feet. Already, the rod was shortening as the robot reabsorbed its shining length, and the literally sphere was rising off the ground, pulling itself up towards him. Swearing loudly, Jim fixed his eyes on the tenacious hook, drawing back one heavy foot. He was going to stamp on it. stamp on this hook. But his experience restrained him. His mighty kick was never launched. He had seen too many rough and tumbles lost by an injudicious attempt at the boot. It wouldn't do at all to let any part of his body get within reach of the robot's superb tools. Instead, he seized a length of dry branch and, inserting one end under the metal hook, began to pry, giving it a bit of leverage. There was a sputtering flash. White and lacy, and then the dry wood, he felt a surge of power running through it that splintered the end. He dropped the smouldering stick with a gasp of pain, wringing his numb fingers. He backed off several steps, full of impotent rage. For a moment, Jim paused, half inclined to run again. But then his upper lip drew back, and snarling, he unslung his rifle. He knew he'd been right to lug the damn thing along all this way, even if it had beat a tattoo shape on his ribs. He now had the robot right where he wanted it, hanging from a cliff. Kneeling down to steady his aim in the failing light, Jim sighted at the hook and fired. There was a soggy thud as the robot dropped down. Jim shouted. The heavy slug had done a lot more than he'd expected. Not only had it blasted the metal claw loose, but it had smashed a big gap in the cliff's edge. It would be pretty damned hard for the robot to use that part of the rock again. He looked down. Sure enough, the robot was back at the bottom. Jim grinned. Every time the thing clamped a hook over the bluff, he'd blow that hook loose, giving it the same treatment. There was plenty of ammunition in his pocket. And the moon would soon be rising, giving him good light for shooting. Meanwhile, he stuck the gun's muzzle inches away from the hook. Besides, the thing, the robot, whatever it might be, was obviously too intelligent to keep up a hopeless struggle. Sooner or later, it would accept the detour and not attempt to come up the cliff. And then maybe the night would help him to hide his trail. Then he choked. For a brief moment, tears came to his eyes. Down below, in the dimness, the spheroid was extruding 3 hooked rods simultaneously in a fan-like spread. In a perfectly coordinated movement, the rods snagged the cliff's edges at intervals of about 4 feet. Jim whipped the rifle back to his shoulder. All right. This was going to be requiring some rapid fire shooting. And it was also becoming dark. The first shot was a bullseye, smacking the left-hand hook loose in a puff of rock dust. His second shot did almost as well, knocking the gritty stuff loose to the centre barb. But even as he whirled to level at number 3, Jim saw it was hopeless. The first hook was already back in place. No matter how well he shot, at least one rod would always be in position, pulling the robot to the top. Jim abandoned his useless rifle and ran into the deepening dark. The toughening of his body, a process of years, was now paying off. But so what? Where was he going? What could he do now? Was there anything that could stop that damn thing behind him, chasing him? Then he remembered the dynamite. Gradually changing his course, the weary man cut back towards his camp under the overhang. Overhead, the stars brightened, pointing the way. Jim lost all sense of time. He must have eaten as he whirled along, for he wasn't feeling hungry. Maybe he could eat when he got back to his shelter and camp. No, there wouldn't be time. Take a Benadryl pill. But the pills were all gone. And the moon was up, and you could hear the robot close behind. Close. Quite often, phosphorescent eyes peered at him from the underbrush, and once, just at dawn, a grizzly growled at him. Sometimes during the night, his wife, Shelley, stood before him with outstretched arms. "Go away," he rasped. "Go away. You can make it. It can't chase both of us." So she turned and ran lightly alongside of him, but then panted across a tiny glade. Shelley faded away into the moonlight, and he realised she hadn't been there at all. Shortly after sunrise, Jim reached his camp. The robot was still close enough for him to hear the dull sounds of its passage and movement. Jim staggered. His eyes closed. He hit himself feebly on the nose, jerking his eyes open, and he saw the explosive cache. The sight of the greasy sticks of dynamite snapped him wide awake. He forced himself into calmness and carefully considered what to do. Fuse? No. It would be impossible to leave fused dynamite in the trail and time the detonation with the absolute precision he needed. Sweat poured down his body. His clothes were sodden with it. It was hard to think. The explosion must be set off from a distance, and at the exact moment the robot was passing over it. But Jim dared not use a long fuse. The rate of burning was not constant enough. He couldn't calibrate it perfectly with the robot's advance. Jim's body sagged all over. His chin sank down toward his heaving chest. He jerked his head up, stepped back, and saw the .22 pistol where he had left it. His sunken eyes flashed. Moving with frenetic haste, he took the half-filled case, piled all the remaining percussion caps among the loose sticks in a devil's mixture. Weaving out to the trail, he carefully placed box and contents directly on his earlier tracks, some 20 yards from a rocky ledge. It was a risk. The stuff might go any time, but that didn't matter. He would far rather be blown to rags and end up living but paralysed in the robot's outside door butcher stall. The exhausted Jim had barely hunched down behind the thin ledge of rock before his relentless pursuer appeared over a slight rise, 500 yards away. Jim scrunched deeper into the hollow. Then he saw a vertical gap, a narrow crack between the rocks. That was it, he thought vaguely. He could sight through the gap at the dynamite and still be shielded for the most part from the blast. He stretched out on his belly, watching the robot roll forward. A hammer of exhaustion pounded his ballooning skull. When had he slept last? This was the first time he had lain down in hours. Hours? It was days. His muscles stiffened, locked into throbbing, burning knots. Then he felt the morning sun on his back, soothing, warming, easing. No. If he let go, if he slept now, it was the robot's macabre collection for him. Stiff fingers tightened around the pistol. He'd stay awake. If he lost, if the robot survived the blast, there'd still be time to put a bullet through his brain.